afternoon, we'll have the opportunity to present to you a very exciting panel discussion on the topic of building trust in AI. My name is Anqi, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Before we get started, I would like to read a disclaimer that the commentary from the panelists today do not represent the views or opinions of their representative organizations. Without further ado, we do have a pretty full list of questions for you all today, but let's just, before we get started, we're gonna do a quick just round robin self-introduction. We'll start with you, Ahmad.
Thanks, Anqi. My name is Ahmad Haider. I'm a Senior Director of Data and Advanced Analytics at Vertex, which is a biotechnology pharmaceutical company based out in Boston. Before that, I have worked in different domains and different industries. Many of them are companies in Atlanta. And today I'm here very excited to talk about the topic of AI that's not that often talked about. It's not the hype, which is essentially talking about building trust in AI, ethical standards, and so on. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. Welcome. And next, we'll pass it to you, Juan.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Juan Gorricho. I'm the head of Data as a Service for TD Bank here in the US. Been with TD about 2 years. Before that, spent about 4 years at Visa. Before that, 10 years at Disney. My whole career has been in data infrastructure, data management, right now leading to building infrastructure that can be used for trustworthy data solutions, data products, AI included. So usually end up talking a lot about not the sexy stuff, not this, but like how hard it is to get it right, and all the things you have to do so to get trust. So that I hope I don't rain on the party. We have the smart people here who can talk about the cool stuff. So.
Sergey Fogelson, you may have seen me on other panels today. Rounding out another one today. Come from TelevisaUnivision. We're a large Spanish language broadcaster here in the United States. We deliver media and entertainment content to Spanish speakers. Before TelevisaUnivision, I worked at Paramount Global / Viacom. I was there for several years. And then before that, I briefly worked at a cybersecurity firm in a bank, and then also in ad tech. And I'm excited to talk about privacy and trust when it comes to LLMs.
All right, thank you, Sergey. So when I was preparing for this panel, I forgot to mention that I lead the analytics team for fair banking compliance at Truist Bank. And I was telling the panelists that I grew up in banking. I've always been in banking. But when I was looking at the LinkedIn profile of these three panelists, they probably represent over a dozen different verticals or industries. So we have a lot of knowledge that's going to be applicable to wherever the industry you're in, the company you're in as well. So in today's panel, we'll be really exploring the critical issue of trust in AI, focusing on security, privacy, and ethical governance, and how organizations can responsibly deploy AI in a way that really builds confidence in our users and consumers as well. So to start with the first question, let's just talk about some overarching principles and ideas, right? How do you build trust with users when deploying AI system that handle really sensitive, maybe client data or transaction data, et cetera? We'll start with you.
Thank you, Anqi. I think there are a few different things that are important in here. I think the first one is the data itself. I think we want to make sure data that is being used to build these AI systems has been collected with the right guidance, with the right standards. You have IP protection into place. You want to make sure the data is clean so that your output is something that you can use. The other thing that is also very important is to make sure that you're able to remove bias. So the system that you're building, people would trust it the more unbiased it is. You don't want to build a system that is very biased and can lead to misinformation. I think third thing also that comes to my mind along with this is that we should be able to provide an ability for users to interact with the data and also provide feedback on that output of the AI. Because that also builds trust if you involve the people who are going to use the outputs as well. And the last thing I would say is in the topic of this panel, privacy. I think not every data should be used, not every data should be used the way it should be used. So I think building a privacy framework and security associated with it is going to be key.
Anyone wanna
So
answer?
I think I agree with the points you raised. I think that what I would add is that because there's a lot of data available, organizations tend to want to use all data for all like purposes that for which way less data can be used, right? And I think that having the right data for the purpose you're chasing is really important, that's one thing. No, so don't abuse the data, don't overuse data that is not needed, right? The second thing is that in order to build trust is transparency on how the data is being used and what is the model, the solution being used for, and how is it making decisions. Right now I'm in banking, right? And so if you're in banking, you realize that the degree of regulation and controls on models that is huge, right? So there's no option to use black box models, no option to, because the models have to be explainable precisely because decisions made by machine learning or AI solutions have to be explained. I would argue that even if you're not in banking, you should do that, right? Like, you should rely on things that you can explain to your customers so that you understand exactly what decisions are being made and why was it made, and so that again, if you're able to do that, you definitely will build trust with your outcomes.
I think I would say that the best way to establish trust with any kind of external clients around LLMs is to make them completely invisible, where the person on the other side doesn't even realize they're interacting with anything that could have been made by Gen AI. What I mean by that is that if any clunkiness exists in whatever solution you've built, customers will immediately, very quickly realize that there's some kind of an LLM or generative AI in the background, which will immediately raise their, heighten their awareness around the experience that they're in, whatever that experience is. And so fundamentally, I think the only way you build trust in this new technology is by having it so that people forget that they're actually interacting with that technology, or not even realize that they're interacting with that technology. Because as soon as there's already, among my cohort anyway, there's already a lot of negativity around interacting with any of these kinds of systems. And so you really have to, I don't want to use the word fool, but I think you have to do something to make it so that the client, whoever that person is that's interacting with your system, doesn't realize that it's completely obfuscated. And only then can you build trust, and you only build trust through very, very long, flawless execution with that specific technology.
Awesome. Just to kind of summarize the common themes here. So trust is really built by ensuring that we have transparency, right? Excellent user experience, flawless, execution on the product we roll out. Securing the sensitive data through very strong protocols and framework, and demonstrate the fairness or your action to debias the data as much as you can, through your regular framework as well. And as someone who sits in compliance, I'm a recovering data scientist, so definitely making sure you have your risk and audit partner on the way to help prevent that bias discrimination is something I just wanted to add on as well. Let's move on to the next question. Let's talk about privacy concerns, right? So what are some of the potential pitfalls that companies should be aware of? So what are some of the key privacy concerns associated with AI, and how companies can address them proactively? Anyone want to take that to start with?
Maybe we start with Sergey this time.
Sure. I think that fundamentally this is such a very, very dangerous place to be with LLMs and privacy, specifically because of the corpuses of data that LLMs are trained on in general. The largest, most complicated models that are coming out of pick your vendor, are basically trained on every piece of text that can be found on the internet. And that is deeply concerning because there is lots of unintentionally private but exposed information that's lurking in all of those places. So you might actually, by deploying a generative AI solution internally that's built on that data, you might actually accidentally be violating the privacy of people that aren't even your customers. which is just hilarious, right? Like the fact that you could have data inside of or you have access to data within your organization's walls of stuff that isn't even your customers, but that you could get sued for, I think is really pretty wild. So I think that in order for you to be 100% certain that you are being privacy safe with your LLM deployment, you have to comb through and make sure that the data that the model was trained on was completely, all of that information was obfuscated. All of it. Because if it's not, you're gonna be able to query it back out somewhere, somehow. And that's a risk. Yeah, so that would be the one thing that I would say. If the data you're training it on is clean, you'll be fine. If it's not, well, good luck.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I think it goes back to what I was saying in the prior conversation, which is what data do you really need to do what you're trying to accomplish? And I think to Sergey's point, I would add that if you're doing something with the data, make sure you have the consent. I think you touched on that, like you're authorized to do that with the data you hold about your customers or even non-customers, right? Because then you can run very quickly into the risk of using data you don't own, you don't have the rights to, for things that you shouldn't be doing with that data. And then also ultimately, I think I see a lot of organizations trying to jump from 0 to 100 in terms of the type of things they want to do in terms of personalization and micro-segmentation. Like, there's no need to do that from the beginning. Like, start slow, learn your way, like control the data, control the outputs, learn to do that, learn how to react. I was reading something that there's about more than 150 data privacy regulations in the world being processed right now, right? So if companies don't do it, then they're going to be even more regulated, and then it's going to be even more expensive and harder to get things done. So I think to Sergey's point, you have a duty to make sure that you know what data you own, what you can use it for, and use it appropriately.
I think that's very well said. I would say, I mean, just building on your point, Juan, like there are so many different privacy laws. There's one in GDPR, which protects the data for people living in Europe. There is HIPAA, which protects all your healthcare data. There are intellectual privacy laws. There are so many different privacy laws. And if you don't have a privacy framework to essentially work through all the different laws, whether it's a PII data, what can be shared, whether it's a PHI data, what can be shared, whether it's something that's protected, it's a credit card data, what can or cannot be shared. If you don't have a privacy framework to essentially tackle that, you would end up in a situation like Sergey described and you described, that you are intentionally or unintentionally using data that would put you in the crosshairs of some law enforcement agency or compliance agency, and then you will have to comply, and that would put a brake on what you're doing right now.
Wow, that's a lot of nuggets here. So definitely staying educated, understand like where the data is coming from, and the caveat that we should make sure we're aware when applying, when we perform analysis on top of the data, right? Make sure we have strong controls and kind of localized, compliance and regulation to, again, provide guardrail. And then I guess, I think I heard it, but I didn't see anyone specifically calling it out, kind of almost like a data minimization principle, right? Only use the data that's for its fit purpose to make sure we have the consent on the pipeline, and as new data is coming in, we're building new solutions on live data sometimes, right? Make sure that we're checking, again, having that, I keep using the word compliance because that's just the word that I'm from right now, really to make sure that, we're doing our best and following the laws and regulations in that way. Moving on to our favorite topic around AI governance. So how can organizations ensure that AI governance is in place to avoid ethical pitfalls?
So I can start, so we can
Go ahead.
Rotate. I think that, the same way there's a data governance organization, there's probably data, like mature organizations that do right things with data have already established data governance models, data councils, right? And this all sounds bureaucratic and process, but it's extremely important. And so similarly, there's, when I was with Visa, for example, Visa established very, very early on an AI ethics board in which the types of use cases, the types of models were being evaluated to make sure that they follow the principles of the organization in terms of privacy, in terms of respect for the customer data and all these things, right? I think that's incredibly important because at the end of the day, there's a really cool solution that is AI-based can actually do a lot of damage if it misfires to the reputation of the organization and to the value. And the risk is way higher than the potential value. So establishing clear guidelines, clear principles from the beginning that are aligned with the organizational principles is incredibly important, right? And so I have an example when I was with Disney many years ago, and the Magic Bands project was launched, right? So you know that Disney has the Magic Bands that you can, so you can imagine the amount of data is being tracked, right? That's being collected in terms of people location. And so there was a lot of, pushback to the Disney CEO about what are you using this data for? How come you're tracking children? Like, why? And his answer was like, this is used to enhance the guest experience, but ultimately, the most important thing that Disney has is the trust of the guests, right? So we are not going to do anything that just like betrays that trust. And we're going to put a lot of guidance in place and controls in place to make sure that whatever is done with this data is appropriate to the consent, to what's expected, and also to what is expected beyond the explicit terms of agreement. Like we all agree when we get there, like we agree to things. Like it's not just what's in paper, but it's also what is the expectation above that. So that the set of those principles comes from those AI ethics boards or ethics councils or whatever you want to call them. But it's not just that. Then it has to be pushed down to the organization through ways that are easy to digest so that it becomes part of the culture.
I think that's really well said. I would say maybe just in terms of having that AI governance board, AI ethics board, maybe two other pieces that are going to be really valuable is performing continuous things like risk assessment audits. Like as you have a board and as new use cases come in, AI is being deployed, is being used, you want to look at what is the risk profile for the organization, given the AI use cases and the content that's generated. And along with that, I would also say maybe things like content validation, misinformation check. You would also want to do that because that's another thing that you want to make sure that the content that you're generating is accurate, because AI right now is not at a level where you can just use it without human intervention.
I don't really have anything to add.
So what I really hear, I guess kind of using my banking terms here, is to really understand your organization's risk appetite and understand that risk-reward trade-off as you are putting in AI governance framework or structure. Based on my personal experience, usually, different industry might have different guidelines in terms of the framework that you need to follow. Establishing a AI-specific committee or ethics committee to provide guardrail, review, make recommendation and correction as well. Regular kind of, again, whether you use audit or for a model, again, at least in the banking world, you have ongoing monitoring, and you need to have that ongoing monitoring, not just the performance, but also maybe monitoring kind of the data drift and the concept drift embedded in the data as well, to make sure that you are deploying AI in a way that that really accounts for the fairness and accountability to avoid the ethical pitfalls. Okay, and we already touched upon this topic earlier, transparency. And it could mean different things in different industries. I'd love to hear about, at least, to your knowledge, the role that transparency plays in making AI more trustworthy and accountable.
Do you want to start this time?
Sure. I think it's, again, with LLMs, I think with simple machine, I say simple and they're already very complicated, with standard classical machine learning algorithms, there are some approximate approaches that give you some amount of interpretability for the outputs of your models. I think that all of that goes away with LLMs. I think it is very, very hard to explain why the output of a given LLM model is the way it is, because it'll actually generate different outputs for the same exact input multiple times, right? Like it's really not deterministic. So from that perspective, I guess the transparency is, well, it's really hard for us to figure out why it is that it answered this question in this specific way. Maybe it's because the temperature on the model was 0.8. Maybe we should lower it to 0.6 next time. Like, I think that I think that with LLMs, you either completely obfuscate that they exist and so the customer doesn't realize and so they don't ask, or you transparently tell them that this is an experiment and that results will be non-deterministic and will vary. And please give us insight into what you think is wrong. I think that, I really don't think, I mean, there's some interesting work that Anthropic is doing around interpreting less complicated large language models. But that's all just, I mean, I really don't know where we're going to be with true interpretability for LLMs, where we're basically just at approximate interpretability for much simpler algorithms now.
May I ask, I don't know, Sergey, if you want to kind of continue a little bit, but I want to hear a little bit more about the accountability portion. Like, do you guys have anything, or?
I mean, I think that's the way that you're accountable by saying, guys, look, like, you show your customers what it is that you know and you don't understand. And if you're not, if you are very risk averse, then maybe you just don't implement it.
Maybe just adding to the accountable portion, I think there are two parties to this accountability. Obviously, the person or the organization that has built this model, and the people who are using it to make decisions on this model, which could be both internal and external. And I think accountability plays a key part, because once you put somebody accountable for a certain set of actions, they are going to make sure that they are going to look at the different laws in place, the amount of variance in output versus one output to another output, type of model that's being used. And I think that will play a key part in how we build more transparency around it. I think we also need to put accountability in terms of the users of the model significantly, because if they are just going to like use it or not use it but not provide any inputs on that, or if the data is being used that they don't think should be used in there, I think the organizations are going to assume things are going fine. I mean, that's the default trend that's happening. So I think there's some accountability on that part too.
No, I think they both said it very, very well. I think that definitely, I like what you were saying, Sergey, but I think that I would add to that either to your point, make users aware, or have a very clear definition of where you use models and how is the process built, so that it doesn't necessarily interact with the customer directly, but probably enables a process behind the scenes, right? So you have to weigh the risk and you have to control where you put it. So, for example, a classic use case that is being very tested heavily in many organizations is, enabling the humans in the call center to find information faster using LLMs, right? So there's a human in the loop whose job is getting significantly more productive, but it's at the end of the day, there's a human who has been trained in customer service procedures, who will make the determination, or will have to, yeah, this is wrong, I'm not gonna give this answer, or I'm gonna just flag this as a wrong answer and move on. But in many cases, it may be the right answer that got to that human faster, right? So, so that to me is the element of transparency there is not as critical, because you have still is the human interacting with the customer, right? But in any case, I think moving away from LLMs a little bit into just more traditional AI, and again, taking the example of banking that I've been in the last few years, is explainability is incredibly important, right? And I would say that if you're going to have models in not LLMs necessarily, but other types of models in a process, then you're better off knowing why is the model doing this, right? And at the speed things can be built right now in technology, that's going to become even harder, right? But I would say, in my experience, there's rarely a need to have a very sophisticated black box model doing very critical processes, right? You have to weigh the risk and reward and put the right model in place for the right situation.
Awesome. Definitely learned a lot in this topic around transparency and what that really means for different organizations, different industries as well. Moving on to the next question, we touch on this a little bit about cybersecurity. I know, Sergey, I'm looking at you. How can AI be designed and deployed with security as a core principle? I pretty much see security as a core principle at any given AI governance framework so far. You want to start?
I would say without L1 support, like what you were talking about, Juan, where like literally there's a person in front of every output of your generative model and they're checking every output. Without that, you can't right now. Like it's just basically, if you have an LLM inside of your organization and it is doing anything that might have an opportunity for interactions with the external world, you should be very, very wary of that piece of technology because, as I'd mentioned in my earlier roundtable or panel discussion, it was that it is a completely unsecured client that has access to, that can potentially have access to all of your organization's information. And so I think security without very, very, very strict bounds on what that generative application is doing is basically, it's basically impossible.
I think to that point, right, I think there's plenty of examples of how these things that have been implemented this way have backfired, right? I think there's can't recall exactly, but there's an example in which someone figured out it was interacting with a chatbot that was powered by an LLM and was able to extract a lot of the data that the LLM was using, which was private data, right? And again, there were no security controls in place, so the core data being used was extracted, right? There's another example of, to your point about how the interaction with the customers, with the external world, if it's not controlled, can backfire. With, I think it was Air Canada, in which LLM-powered chatbot gave the wrong advice to a passenger who lost a lot of money, right? And the passenger sued the airline, and the airline said, no, it wasn't us, it was the chatbot, right? And so finally the court said, no, you are accountable for that. So you can't, hey, the Tesla crash, it was the autopilot. No, you can't. Like, it's you at the end of the day behind the wheel, right? So I think that goes to accountability and also to how do you put the right controls in place to ensure that the wrong things don't happen, bad things don't happen.
I think that's a very good answer. I would say, I mean, in addition to it, when you're developing any Gen AI model, and if you want to keep security into consideration, I think first thing you have to do is you have to create a development team where you have a security engineer in there. I think that's a default thing. I mean, typically that's not always the case. When you start developing, you have a bunch of data scientists and data engineers in the room, not necessarily a security engineer in the very beginning. This is super important because in this case, you're going to collect data from different places, and there's network security, endpoint security, data security. A lot of those things come into play. And the other thing I would say is, which is, as it's being used, you might get a lot of, I would say, alerts, and have somebody be part of that L1, L2 team, responding to alerts, and doing that incident management, and looking at how to essentially remediate those to make sure that it is security compliant. Because you will not be able to figure everything out, even if you put a vulnerability software tracker, all of those different tools and technologies, they're not yet developed to handle everything that a Gen AI will throw at it right now.
And I think, so the one thing that you touched on, which is interesting, is that, or both of you have touched on, is that what you don't want is that something really bad to happen, to then have a ton of regulation on top of how these things can be used, right? Because then that's usually, again, like there's a lot of noise around the AI regulation in Europe, right? Which is like probably gonna clash. You know, it's gonna block innovation from happening because, again, I think they are over-indexing on controlling too much, right? So if as an organization you implement this the right way with the right controls, you'll show responsibility towards regulators who will let you continue being, instead of just having a ton of unmanageable regulation put on top of your organization, your country, your industry.
Yeah.
So I want to just have a follow-up there. I know we're going a little off script here. So in terms of managing, especially, I know in financial services, probably a lot of other industry as well, there's a slight difference in terms of in-house homegrown solutions versus a vendor solution. In this case, when we're talking about Gen AI, it's pretty difficult for companies or organizations of even large size to develop their own Gen AI solutions. There's reliance on the vendors. How do we make sure that the security in that sense is also covered in your practice, especially when things are moving out of a proof of concept, proof of technology into production?
I think a similar principle apply. I mean, if you're developing your in-house solution for Gen AI, I think you would essentially, like for any solution, the components are always, what is your data, what's your compute, what are the systems it's connecting to, and who's the user who's using it. I mean, you would essentially look at all those different factors, and you would look at like what are the different security risks that you have for each one of those, and you will do a threat modeling exercise to figure those out, and then address those specific risks. I think when you're buying an external solution, of course, then you're assuming that solution actually takes care of a lot of those. I think you would still subject it to a third-party risk management process where you're going to review that solution based on your organization's guidelines. And you'd still look at those parameters, but those organizations may have already solved for it. Like you might say, for example, if you're buying a solution, and it might at behind the scenes is using a OpenAI model to query to give you data, and you want to look at, well, is your query data actually going to OpenAI servers and being stored there? Or is it actually not going to the servers, being taken out? Or we are going to look at, is the output being fairness managed or bias managed or not, or is it just being sent out? So you would do some of that exercise. When you buy a solution, in many cases, they may have those controls, but it's still your job to look at it.
No, I agree. I think it goes back to something we've touched on, which is what is the use case, what are you solving for, and what is the appropriate solution for that use case, right? Like there might be solutions in which, like the OpenAI model, the open source model, they are fine, right? Because the risk of something wrong going on with those models, something is minimal. But on the other hand, I think to Sergey's point, like if you're going to use like your data in a critical process that then interacts with customers, then using your data with like the open model, that would not be feasible, right? So I think this goes back to when the solution has been implemented, is do you have the right parties watching, like the right risk assessment, the right parties understanding what the purpose is and the right controls, and then sort of blessing how these things being implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with both the other panelists. I think ultimately you want to make sure that whatever solution you're building is not a solution that is going to have unrestricted access outside of your walls. That's all. Like as long as you have that, and there's no ability to exfiltrate whatever usable internal data that you have, is probably the kind of your best path forward for making sure that security happens.
And I think that's a really good point. When the GenAI hype started, 2 years ago, right? There was a lot of people in the companies like, oh, why can't we access the models, right? I should be able to take my code and put it in open ChatGPT, and so that goes back a little bit to the role of AI governance, is to explain why this cannot be done and what's happening, because at the end of the day, it's everybody's responsibility in an organization to understand the risk you're running by taking your data and putting it in a model. There's the Samsung example, right? There were a bunch of Samsung engineers that took a bunch of Samsung proprietary documents and loaded them into ChatGPT to analyze them, and they didn't realize by doing that, they just made those documents part of the data that ChatGPT can use for all the trade, right? So they just basically gave up a bunch of proprietary. But it's like that education on the responsibility as an employee that they have with your company's data and how to use the tools appropriately.
I'm good.
Awesome. Definitely learning a lot of different things here. Moving to the next question. So we already talked about different organizations have shared interests and opportunities and challenges as well. So what are some of the biggest ethical challenges when it comes to AI? How can organizations tackle them?
I think there are a few that come to mind. We have talked about some of them already. Discrimination is one. Unintended use of AI, depending on a particular situation, can unfairly discriminate against a segment of the population. You have to be really careful about that. Misinformation is another one, which is if AI hallucinates and if you're not fact-checking its content, you could lead to propagation of wrong information, or I would say biased information. The third one is, in a very similar tone, you can introduce bias into it, so which is essentially your AI, depending on the data that you feed, it will give you outcomes, content, etc., that's tuned to a particular audience or a particular segment, etc. That's another one. And then obviously there is the whole governance, regulations, and laws, etc. And I think when you are not following those, I think that is a challenge that you will run afoul of a lot of those compliance rules.
I think that when it comes to the ethics of any complicated technology, especially with generative AI, I think what's really critical is what's used to build that technology and how that impacts how the technology will be used. And in the case of generative AI tools, they are built on data, right? Like lots and lots of it. And so the only way you can really guarantee that the tool has the appropriate ethical guardrails in place. And the thing that makes it really complicated is that it's also based on the end user, right? Like people have different ethical, not everyone, but many people have different ethical approaches to different issues. And so what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that the data that the generative AI algorithm that I'm trained on is different than the data that your generative AI solution is trained on? Because at the end of the day, that's all it is, right? Like these technologies, they're really just very complicated nonlinear compressions of the stuff that you put into it. But the problem is, again, with the large open source models, if you're not training it yourself on your own hand-selected data, it's trained on all of the internet, all of the publicly facing internet, which includes both the slop and the actual good stuff, right? And I don't know that anybody's really figured out where that dividing line is and like how to get rid of the slop. And so I think it just makes it very, very challenging to really truly talk about ethics with these kinds of models.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both answers. I think what I would add is that the challenge, so I love the point about any new technology, any complex technology will have ethical challenges to some degree, right? And so it's your duty to understand what those challenges are, put controls, understand how to mitigate those challenges, and that depends on the context, the culture, the situation, the data you use. I think that 100% agree with that. I think the challenge with Gen AI and this type of or AI in general is that it's moving so fast that there may be things that are really hard to think about that are going to come out of those models that may be unethical, right? And I think that there's a really, if you listen to Trevor Noah's podcast, What Now? I think the episode last week, he has a Yuval Noah Harari talking about his latest book, right? And so they talk about when AlphaGo beat the Chinese player on the game of Go, which is thousands of years, right? The Chinese guy said, what impacted him the most is that the things the model was doing were things that he would have never expected to be done in the game, right? And so similarly, the point they're making in the podcast is we don't the speed at which things can move, and the complexity is going to bring to light things that we haven't even thought about that may be unethical, that may be wrong, right? So that's why a lot of what gets done with this has to be commensurate with you cannot just adopt it blindly and just go all in without having the right controls and the right maturity and so watching it closely, because it can get very easily out of control.
Maybe one other point, just coming back, something that I've heard about AI and more so about Gen AI in the last several years is the concern around job displacement. And I think that is an ethical concern that has come up because of the potential for Gen AI to do a lot of automation. And automation essentially can potentially affect this. And I think, and I've seen in many different places, like this idea of reskilling and upskilling to essentially to essentially identify the types of activities that can be brought to the forefront, more value-added activities, and has helped us concern. But that is something that I do want to raise because that has been identified in many cases.
Absolutely. Actually, yesterday, one of the roundtables, we were talking about, it's been 2 years. Have we really realized a lot of jobs? Actually, we've seen a lot of job cuts, right? But I feel like companies are sometimes maybe jump the gun and proactively doing that. But are jobs actually being, significantly impacted and replaced in production? Have we seen the ROI on the, on the investment at this point, right? So I think a lot of things are, we're still kind of watching and trying to calculate that as we go. I would say, in my job today, my job is just how do we define and measure fairness and bias quantitatively, right? And I was just kind connecting with someone at the round table, talking about the regulations that are in banking. For example, my best friend CFPB right now is giving a lot of kind of signals and expectations in terms of how do we measure bias and in models, right? Not just AI machine learning models, but all models might have an impact on the consumer, right? And maybe the FDA will catch up at some point, so across the industry, there's a lot of cross-pollination, so we can, continue to solve and watch out for different ethical challenges as well. Moving on to the last kind of structured question we have here, I know some of you have talked about this earlier, is how do we, find the balance between the need for innovation in AI with the, responsibilities to protect our users' data and privacy?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think to your point, actually, we've talked about it. To me, it goes back to this is just another. It's technology. It's a new solution, right? And ultimately, an organization has a business goal and a business purpose that can be enabled by technology, right? So as long as you understand that and use it appropriately, with the right controls, with the right privacy frameworks, with the right, you should be fine. I think is when technology is being put in place for technology's sake, right? Because it's cool and it's shiny and it can do really cool things. That's when things can go wrong from any dimension, ethical dimensions, privacy dimensions, all those different things. Again, I go back to the example of Disney and the Magic Bands, right? Like people think that it was implemented as a technology project because it was cool to use RFID and all this data to. It was not, right? It started as a project, it's an initiative to improve the guest experience. The most important thing that Disney guests have in the parks is the experience, right? And so the experience was breaking apart because of attendance and nothing. And so it was an initiative was built to enhance the guest experience leveraging technology, right? So similarly with AI is just another tool. It's another set of technology that can make the organization's life better in many dimensions. And that, when you think about it from that perspective, there's a lot of things that have to be ready for it to be used. Data has to be right. You have to have the right data available, data quality, right? And like the gaps in data quality that organizations have to be able to use AI. They just forget AI. Do basic reporting are huge, right? So you cannot leapfrog that, right? Then there's all the elements of controls and risk management. And so as long as like you're thinking from that perspective and advancing in a way that the maturity, that the solutions matches the maturity and the ability to get technology, you'll be fine, right? But again, it's just another technology that should be used to enable the business purpose, not just for the sake of using technology, cool technology.
I totally agree with that. For me, it's like almost, do you want to put the cart before the horse or not? That's pretty much it. I would absolutely agree, and I would say having a data governance board and AI governance board is a manifestation of what you described about, and that should be one of the mandates that they should have. Something that I've seen is this idea of like, it's a very common concept, exploration versus exploitation. How much of exploration would you do? How much of exploitation? I think in this case, having a data governance board, and with it, not only having the mandate for privacy, etc., but also understanding what data can be used. Is it at the right quality? What compute are you using? Is the compute sending data somewhere else? Do you have the right framework for security for your organization? I think that should be done, but along with that, we also want small teams in the organization focusing on the use cases, not necessarily the implementation of use cases, but understanding how to prioritize use cases that will deliver competitive differentiation to the organization. And I think if those teams spend time understanding what those use cases are, and by the time we have aligned on those, then we can marry them with the way of responsible implementation, and you'll get a really good outcome at the end. It's a different strategy than like build and they will come.
I would just say that if you're talking about innovation versus privacy, I think companies have been drunk on innovation for a really long time, and I think innovating for the sake of innovating is really not helpful. It's, as one of my now friends told me during we had basically a sponsored dinner after the event last night, Anvar, he talked about it's bringing the cherry on the cake without having the cake. Like, that's what kind of thinking about generative AI use cases, and in many cases within an enterprise, it's that you've got to get the cake built, make the cake first, and then when you've gotten it all right and you still haven't had any issues with privacy, only then do you actually consider like sprinkling in some Gen AI use case to, innovate on some business process. And only then should you actually really think about, well, is the cherry worth it? Because at the end of the day, reputational damage to the brand of your organization it can sink it, right? I mean, like if somebody, it would be like akin to a bunch of people finding out that, Chipotle gives you diarrhea. Like, that's it, man. You're done. You're not eating at Chipotle ever again, and Chipotle just lost billions of dollars. Like, these kinds of things will happen to your organization should you get it wrong. It would just be the, getting diarrhea version for whatever it is that your company makes.
Very vivid example.
All right, before we go for kind of our lightning round, I just want to take a quick pause and see if we have any questions in the room. I can't really see everyone, so if there are questions, or if anyone can help me.
We don't even know if there's people in the room. Like, we
we
can't see anything.
anybody.
Like, we can't. Oh, there you go. Oh, there's some people.
All right. The questions around transparency, explainability in complex models, kind of using black box, or a lot of times just vendor solutions are a little black box in nature, right? How do we make sure we're considering those factors?
I know this is close to Sergey's heart.
We talked about it earlier, right, guys? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm happy to pontificate forever, but I can't believe you guys are all still here. It's literally the last panel on a Friday afternoon. You guys all deserve lots of whatever your favorite vice is after this. I think that it's basically impossible to explain generative AI model innards right now. I don't think that there is any technology that we've built, any algorithm that we've built that can provide the level of explainability that I think normal people want for outputs of generative AI models. I think we have to get it right. We have a hard enough time doing the same thing with non-generative AI models. That's what I would say.
Maybe one thing that I've seen, which obviously cannot give you full transparency and explainability, but to a small modicum is this idea of referential checking, which is all the outputs that a generative AI is essentially using to summarize and present to you as part of any information retrieval, is to provide references to those outputs and check if those references are accurate as well and are not generated.
Awesome. So we're almost at time, so sorry we can't take more questions. Just go for one last lightning round. I wish we had like a Gen AI bingo in front of us. So in one phrase or field, can each of you share a key insight or takeaway about balancing innovation and privacy? We'll start with you, Ahmad.
I would say for me, the key takeaway is responsible use of AI by first focusing on understanding the value of AI to your business, the idea of baking a cake before putting sprinkles. Then, as Juan talked about, putting a governance framework in place, so your data privacy board, your AI privacy board. And I think the last piece is helping understand where Gen AI can provide you that competitive advantage to your organization once you have put the foundation of your AI ethics in place.
To me, it goes back to what is the business purpose and how can technology and what type complexity of technology, AI-based or not, can be used for that business purpose. That takes precedence, right? Sometimes a very basic model will do, sometimes a more complex model will do, but it all has to be in the context of what are you doing with this thing, right? And who's doing something with it, and what is the business value? It's very easy to take there have been plenty of projects I've been part of in which really cool models were built that had no problem to be solved, right? And so the people complain about all the investment that was being done and AI sucks. It's like, well, like if you didn't start with a business outcome within a business process, then of course that's going to happen, right? So business outcomes, business purpose, what are you doing, and match the technology to the process and the maturity of the organization and your capabilities, the data you have, and all those different things.
I would say learn from the mistakes of other companies when you're balancing innovation and privacy, because you won't have time to learn from your own.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists today.